Thank you everyone who's here today. So the research I'm presenting here is actually focused on the arid regions of the Syro-Jordanian steppe, but is part of a long-term project focused on the climatic margins of the Fertile Crescent in general. This long-term project seeks to examine the origins of the widespread settlement patterns in the semi-arid and arid portions of the Syrian and Jordanian steppe together as a single region-wide entity. It's also looking at universal factors of sedentism in these climatically marginal and also uncertain regions, and at the two-way relationship between natural and anthropogenic environment and sedentism and also nomadism, as well as overarching coping strategies employed across both connected and unconnected communities. So the study region, as stated, is the Syrian and Jordanian steppes, and within that I've selected three areas of detailed study, these being the Greater Western Jazira and Shamia in Syria, and then the Northern Badia in Jordan. These regions were chosen as they represent a cross-section of the different climatic and environmental conditions of the region, all the way from areas of relative fertility through to the semi-arid regions and then down to the very arid regions such as in northern Jordan. These are also areas that have seen at least a modicum of fieldwork over the years, which is a bit of a rarity in these arid regions. And in fact, in northern Jordan, fieldwork is still ongoing with several projects working in the Badia, including the Western Harra Survey, which I co-direct with Marie-Laure Chambrade of Archaeology, which is a survey that has been going since 2014 and has so far comprised 4 fieldwork seasons. So as stated, this region comprises a variety of landscapes, all the way from very fertile ones, such can be seen in the top left, to the semi-arid landscape in the top right, the boundaries between semi-arid and arid in the bottom left, and then in the bottom right you can see the almost desert landscape of the Hara, the basalt desert of northern Jordan. Within this region, it is possible to define what has been called a zone of uncertainty. This is a region that is roughly defined as being between the 180 and 300 millimeter isohyates, but is more properly defined as being a region where mobile pastoralism and adaptive economic strategies are a requirement for human subsistence. And indeed, this is a reason why mobility can be assumed for inhabitants of these semi-arid and arid regions in the first place. Mobility is required for subsistence to an extent even in the semi-arid parts, but definitely in the arid regions. And since resources are scarce in this area, trade would have been an essential economic component. Furthermore, there are already some existing and well-established evidences for site morphology equivalences, which I will discuss soon. So site morphologies present themselves as a go-to distinguishing method for identifying knowledge transmission across the arid parts of this region for several reasons. First of all, they can be divided into distinct and relatively well-recognized categories. They are clearly identifiable by remote sensing, most notably satellite imagery, which is essential not for a study across such a large area, but also one that encompasses regions which it is unfortunately impossible to currently visit on the ground. Also, the distinctness of the majority of these site types makes some sort of unconnected or convergent origins much less likely than for something generic like mounds or circular enclosures. So for this study, the site types of the Jordanian Badia, all of which are found within the area of the Western Harra Survey, were used as a basis, as these are the best research sites in the arid parts of the Syro-Jordanian steppe, even if the study of them is in many ways still in its infancy. One has, for example, the so-called desert kites, well known as being hunting infrastructures designed to trap migrating gazelle herds. Enclosure groups, which are no more than groupings of circular or subcircular enclosures. Pendants, which are funerary contexts. These are complexes which are comprised of a single stone cairn, such as you can see here, and then a linear arrangement of stone piles emanating from it. And finally, we have these meandering walls of yet unknown purpose, which stretch for many kilometers across the region. Now, one of the main focuses of the Western Harra Survey are the sites known as wheels and enclosure clusters, sometimes encircled enclosure clusters. In fact, it was the work of the Western Harra Survey that formed the distinction between these two, as you have wheels, which are these circular sites or sometimes rounded polygonal sites with straight internal walls going to the center, much like the spokes of a wheel. Whereas enclosure clusters have much more irregular outlines and are really a conglomeration of various shapes of enclosures. Sometimes these enclosure clusters are surrounded by a circle of very small rectangular enclosures, however, not always. These sites comprise, as far as we know, a wide range of settlement dates or occupation dates, at any rate. Kites are amongst the earliest structures of the region, dated to at least the early Neolithic, if not earlier, though they were much reused in later times. Enclosures are potentially much later, up to and including the early Bronze Age. Pendants probably even later, during the Iron Age, around the first millennium BC. And finally, the wheels and enclosure clusters likely date between the late Neolithic and the early Chalcolithic, possibly into the late Chalcolithic as well. Now, at the last ICAANE conference in 2018, I presented the identification of some sites in the Western Jazira, which are quite analogous with those we find in Jordan. For example, enclosure clusters, such as can be seen here, and also more specific types of enclosures, such as this large enclosure with 4 adjacent small enclosures around, which has a very good analogy, as can be seen in the bottom left. Also, I introduced the possibility that wheel sites also exist in the Western Jazira, though these are nowhere near as clear as the nice example I showed you on the last slide. There are also relatively unclear examples in the northern Badia, so there are analogies all the same. However, these were all site identifications made more or less at random by a cursory look at the remote sensing data. But for proper comparison and also the chance of the quantification of the data sets, a systematic satellite survey was required. This was already completed back in 2014 for the Western Harra Survey as a preparation for that project's first fieldwork season. By using the Google Earth platform at the native resolution of the satellite imagery, I investigated this region line by line, latitudinal line by latitudinal line, and marked any visible sites and labeled them by both category and clarity. I've recently completed a similar analysis for the southern portion of the Greater Western Jazira. This is the most arid part of that region and is, in terms of landscape and hydrology, the closest to the Badia, although obviously still with much greater precipitation and proximity to perennial water sources. Now, while I carried out actually a systematic satellite survey of the entire Greater Western Jazira for my PhD research about a decade ago, that was done using corona images from the 60s and 70s, which are perfectly sufficient and in fact most desirable for Bronze Age mounds, which were the focus of that study. But they're not sufficient for the small structures of the kind being researched here. So this time, aerial imagery available via the Microsoft Earth platform, also known as Bing, was found to be the best option. Now, if we compare the sizes of these regions, the southern area of the Greater Western Jazira is much larger than the Western Harra Survey area. However, it contains far fewer sites. In fact, there are 8 times the density of sites in the northern Badia as there are in the southern area of the Western Jazira. However, it's very important to take into account the extreme differences in both the visibility and the preservation of sites in the Western Jazira, with a very relatively high aeolian and hydrological transformation processes, as well as heavy anthropogenic transformations, not least very intensive farming over the last 50 years or so, compared to the almost pristine northern Badia with very limited transformation processes. Nevertheless, this is a very large difference in site density. However, if we compare simply the sites in the basalt areas represented in red on these maps, which is a far more equivalent comparison really, the differences decrease significantly to the point where it's really possible that the transformation processes of the Western Jazira alone account for it, and the densities may be regarded as almost similar. A general overview of some of the site forms identified in the Western Jazira show up some familiar types, such as single enclosures and enclosure groups, the pendants, as mentioned, these burial complexes, which are unfortunately a little unclear on this satellite image, but you can see that the main burial cairn is indicated there by the black arrows and the linear alignment of stone piles by the white arrows. And then also the desert kites, some of which were already known to exist here due to the research of the Global Kites project. Others were identified newly by my satellite survey, but these constitute already very well established site morphology connections between Jordan and the Western Jazira. In detail, I have focused on enclosure clusters and wheels, the distinction of which, as I mentioned, is one of the focuses of the Western Harra Survey. Here's some very typical enclosure clusters from the Western Jazira, which are very similar to those of the Northern Badia. These are their rough outlines. It is possible that some of these may also have had these small encircling enclosures. For example, the site on the left looks like there are some kind of structures at its southern end, but the limitations of both site preservation and satellite imagery in the Greater Western Jazira prevent any certainty on this. There are other enclosure clusters also identified in the Western Jazira, which are still similar in form, however significantly larger. For example, the one shown here on the right has a long axis of around 80 meters, which is in fact 3 times the size of that shown in the bottom left, which is a very typical example in northern Jordan. Now, some of these clusters bear enough similarities with wheels to potentially be considered as such. For example, this site here, where I'm pretty sure that this wall, which, although it's not very visible, continues to form a central enclosure, as does this one here, and therefore forms a more or less wheel shape with an adjacent extra enclosure, for which there are also analogies in Jordan. However, since only 2 of the almost 2,000 sites identified in the southern portion of the Western Jazira could be assigned to this category, we don't have much degree of confidence on this. Another interesting feature type identified by the satellite survey is probable water catchment features for channeling and temporarily storing rainwater, either directly or by channeling it from seasonal wadis. Here we see an aerial photograph of the site of Tulul al-Hussein in the eastern part of the Jordanian Badia, with what Bernd Müller-Neuhoff has termed gardens up here along the slopes of a volcano for catching precipitation, and also other enclosures such as this one down here, seemingly for collecting runoff from gullies. We have very similar structures to the latter in the Western Jazira. These enclosures which straddle rainwall runoff gullies, especially this one here on the right, which can be seen to have a small gap at the top for letting water in, running then round the bottom and closing off the gully almost like a dam to conserve the water. We also have similar structures to the so-called gardens at Tulul al-Hussein, and potentially similar also to the gardens at the site of Jawa, with these very large enclosures on the downhill faces of escarpments, especially the ones depicted here on the right, these very elongated enclosures, which are quite unique and unlike any other that would probably be used for habitation or animal corrals. Not all the stone structures of the Greater Western Jazira were found to have analogies in northern Jordan, however. For example, we have these unusual pendant features. Pendants, of course, essentially constitute one large stone mound and then a line of small stone mounds, and these also match that pattern. However, here we have multiple large cairns interspersed by very, very long tails of stone piles which just connect one to the other. Over here on the right, we have almost a definite cairn, a luted cairn, but the arrangement of stone piles that emanate from it are in fact circular. And finally, at the bottom right, we have a cairn with 3 tails, which is a pendant that's perhaps analogous with some of the sites identified by David Kennedy in Saudi Arabia, for example, in the Harat Khahat and the Harat Khaybar, but are not so far known in the Jordanian Harat al-Sham. There are also a fairly large number of these horseshoe-shaped enclosures, which are enclosures that are only on 3 sides. In fact, these comprise 7% of all sites identified in the Greater Western Jazira in the southern portion. And sometimes they appear as individual enclosures, sometimes, as in the bottom right, as part of enclosure groupings. As far as I know, these are not very common in the Jordanian Badia, at least in the Western Harra Survey. We don't have any examples of them. Now, to enable a more confident assessment of the similarities and differences between the site forms across these two regions, I carried out some quantification of the shapes themselves. And this was made possible by the accuracy and precision of data obtained from drone flights in the Western Harra Survey area. By collaborating with the Royal Film Commission of Jordan, we were able to fly drones in both April and September of 2019. And this enabled us to obtain excellent results for selected structures in the area and to create both orthomosaics and digital elevation models, as well as some three-dimensional models. This allowed for very precise measurement of site morphologies in the Western Harra Survey, giving accurate data both for studies within the survey region, but also as a control group for other areas. Again, wheels and enclosure clusters were selected for comparison, since these are sites that are often conflated and also can largely be distinguished by a single geometric property, that being the shape of their outer perimeter, with those of wheels being relatively regular, oval, circular or rounded polygons, whereas the perimeter of enclosure clusters being far more irregular with concavities. Now, to define this visual discrepancy mathematically, the longest chord, that is the longest straight line internal to the perimeter, was measured at a selection of such sites, since it is clear that for a wheel, the correlation between the longest chord and the site area will be strong, whereas conversely for an enclosure cluster, the correlation will be weaker due to a greater variety in irregular perimeters. Also, the area of an enclosure cluster will be relatively smaller compared to its longest chord, since it is very clear that a theoretical wheel with the same chord length as the enclosure cluster shown on the right would have a much greater area. Now, plotting these variables from a selection of sites in the Western Harra Survey on a scatter graph showed that there is not a very large variation between the data groups. However, enclosure clusters are definitely on average having smaller areas for any given chord length than do wheels. Furthermore, wheels seem to have a moderately clearer correlation, so that a very tentative linear trend line can be calculated, while this does not appear to be as feasible for the enclosure clusters, although part of this is probably due to the fact that fewer enclosure clusters were analysed. However, if we add the new data from the Greater Western Jazira, it in fact provides much more convincing results. In the Western Jazira, the two extra wheels there do not change the trend line for wheels at all. But for the enclosure clusters, it appears that they display now a greater similarity to wheels at smaller sites, down here, but a much larger discrepancy at larger sites and also more variation in the relationship. Now, by adding a trend line for these enclosure clusters in the Greater Western Jazira, we can see a confirmation of this. Now, naturally, some of the convergence of the data sets at small sites may be due to increased relative measurement error over small distances, but overall it seems to indicate that larger enclosure clusters have more irregular outer perimeters. If we now draw a trend line for the few enclosure clusters studied in the Western Harra Survey, we see an extremely close correlation with the trend line of those in the Western Jazira. And importantly, this remains even if we extrapolate that trend line beyond the sizes of enclosure clusters that exist in Jordan. This appears to quite clearly provide quantified evidence for the close similarity in site morphology of enclosure clusters between the northern Badia and the southern Greater and Western Jazira, which shows that the construction techniques in terms of enclosure numbers and shapes were broadly similar across the greater region, even if individual differences exist, such as the fact that those in the Western Jazira include much larger sizes. So it can fairly confidently be said now that there is enough evidence to propose knowledge transmission during all time periods across the arid Syro-Jordanian steppes. Now, already the kite phenomenon has been mapped across this area and indeed beyond, indicating such connectivity during the early Neolithic and earlier periods as well, probably. while for later periods, connectivity has always been surmised due to the general evidence of the long distances that raw materials are known to have been transported during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Ages. But the equivalent pendants, probable water catchment features, and the quantifiably similar enclosure clusters now provide strong evidence of such connections during these later periods. And this consisted probably not only of a trading in goods and also knowledge transmission, but potentially also connections in terms of ritual or belief systems, since the funerary structures of pendants are very similar. However, there are enough differences, such as the unusual pendants, the horseshoe-shaped sites, and the varied maximum enclosure cluster sizes to indicate a separate, despite being connected, cultural development. Additionally, the presence of water catchment features in the southern western Jazira, often only a few tens of kilometers away from the nearest river, indicates that the inhabitants of the visible structures were not merely travelers passing through the region who would have carried their own water with them, but long-term occupants, most likely, who rarely, if ever, visited the fertile riverbanks. This in turn ties into much later evidence from the Mari and Ebla texts of permanent nomadic inhabitants of the western Jazira during the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. To conclude, the quantification of aspects of site forms and morphologies can be used to more confidently assess the veracity of a claim of similar sites, and therefore lend greater credence to any hypotheses of knowledge transmissions from a remote sensing perspective. Ideally, of course, this is done in combination with fieldwork, which would allow such hypotheses to be properly concretized. But even in the absence of that being possible, for example, in the case of Syria, this methodology can still be used to vastly improve what can otherwise be very subjective claims. The next step for our project is a similar analysis of the Shamir region, and then after that, looking at areas in between these regions in a stratified random sample approach by selecting areas of around 30 by 30 kilometers, the rough size of the Western Harra Survey, scattered across the region, and analyzing these systematically by satellite imagery. This will hopefully then take us a significant further step towards understanding the dynamics of human occupation of the arid Syro-Jordanian steppes across all of prehistory. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to all our partners and people who enabled these projects to happen. And in the top right, you can see the links where you can follow the Western Harra Survey online. Thank you.